We have tons of questions coming in Slido, so we are going to start to respond to some of them. If we don't have a chance to go through all of them, we will be taking a look at it and we will do our best to follow up with you after today's session. So Nancy, Alycia, I'm just going to start here. So some of these have, let's start with some of the institutional questions. So there are a couple of questions which I think have similar undertones. So the questions are really around how do we engage staff in discussions about whiteness, especially when staff are feeling stretched already. So coming back to the idea of what organizations prioritize, as well as any tips for dealing with leadership in organizations who are usually predominantly white, particularly senior leadership. So how do we have these conversations in organizational settings? How do we engage staff? How do we engage leaders? Nancy, Alycia, I'll let you get started.
Well, I always think it's a good idea to either ask a question or make a statement about it. It's a good place to start, and it's, you know, kind of less confrontational, shall we say, if we just say, wow, so we're all white, but we're making decisions for this entire population. Or like, you can just say there's a lot of white people here, which I've actually seen done in Zoom meetings. And it's quite interesting to see the response, because people actually had to stop and think. Someone had mentioned the Seeing White podcast. I was listening to one of the episodes earlier today, and one of the hosts was saying, like, it's just for some reason, no matter if the statement is innocuous, when you call someone white, they flinch, because it's just not used to being, it's not said. Right? It's not said enough. So it's something that people have to get comfortable with and dealing with. And in this day and age, there's a whole bunch of organizations in healthcare and elsewhere, academia, that have diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and plans. And you can't do that. You're not going to do it successfully if you don't actually change your leadership structure. And, you know, like we said, that's not just about including folks. It's actually about changing the system and the organization. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. Great points. And I agree about, you know, talking about it, you know, talking about this, talking about whiteness, even just by talking about race, by talking about your own race, by talking about your own racial identity. Nobody can take that away from you. Nobody can argue with you about how you identify. And it is one way to kind of bring race into the conversation that, you know, even when you have those, you know, powerful people in your organization who don't want to talk about it. And if other people get uncomfortable with it and you see that tension, just know that that's part of the work. And I think, like Nancy said, you know, every chance we get to ask, you know, in some of the work that I'm doing, you know, I'm always asking, so, you know, what's our plan for engaging Indigenous people in this work? And I'll tell you, you know, I want to make a whole list of responses, you know, and excuses. And, you know, one of the ones that I keep hearing up again and again is like, you know, it's just high level for now. Like, this is just high level. And, you know, it's just such a great example of systemic racism. Keeping things at high level is one tactic of keeping Indigenous people out of conversations. So by continuing to ask these questions, and sometimes, you know, for myself, you know, it can feel, you can tell people get tired of hearing it. You can tell people, like, or at least I feel like every time I open my mouth, oh, you know, there's Alycia again, like he's saying the same thing over and over. What is she calling us, racist? Is she assuming, you know, people will say, are you assuming that I haven't talked to my Indigenous colleagues? You know, so I think, you know, continuing to ask these conversations, when we ask over and over again, it's really important. And then you do start to kind of find your friends. And that's why I also think it's important when you're looking at, when it's all white people at the top in your organization, you know, find the white people who get it a little bit. You know, find the white people who are willing to move it forward. Those are your friends, those are your allies. You can work together strategically. You know who they are. And some people, you know, don't give up. You know, some people, I've seen so much growth and learning, you know, in a short period of time. When you get a momentum, when you get a collection of people together, no matter what level they're at, it can start to move things. And one of the ways, if you get people who are interested, you can start by even this webinar. This is a great example. That's why we do this stuff. That's why we do this stuff. So you can, you know I sent it around to, you know, to my team. You can send it around to your friend. You can be like, oh, wait, let's get together and talk about this. And, it doesn't have to be your voice. Your voice can be inserting other voices, into the conversation as a place to launch and to start to have this. And then, the last thing that I want to say is just around this is I know, I'm doing some work in my own community, my own Jewish community, actually, around anti-racism, which is really exciting. And, someone made the comment, this is really important, Alycia, but, we don't have the time, we're all volunteering. And I saw there was another question earlier, I don't forget to it, about, what do we do? We don't have time, everyone's really busy. We have so many things on our schedules. If we care about this issue, we got to invest in it. And, if we don't know how to do it, of course, and if we don't have the time, fair, hire someone, hire BIPOC, hire people who can do this work, hire people who love doing this work. All of us, we love doing this work. This is important. This is, this is such meaningful work. I want to be part of a world that's more equitable, where there isn't racism. And there's people out there who do this kind of stuff and can help you, and people who, appreciate the journey that it takes and are willing to not give up when things get tough. And I think that's the kind of stamina, that's the emotional stamina and the white stamina, as opposed to the white fragility, that we need to do this kind of a work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nancy and Alycia, for those. But one thing I'll add there is around the power of community, because sometimes it's helpful to bring people who are external to the organization, particularly if they are in the community, and as Alycia was saying, have been doing this work already. So there are lots in every community. You will find people who have been doing this work for a long time. You find communities who have deep knowledge, both in terms of lived experience, but also as like content subject matter experts. And I say those two things for one reason. Is I think a lot of times when we talk about community knowledge, we forget that there are people within systems, we are examples, who have lived experience of racism and other things, who are also part of the system. So, and it's sometimes easy to shut down those voices and just go outside. It goes back to some of what I think either Nancy or Alycia said around the kinds of repercussions people get when they raise this. So really valuing that. And loving a comment we said in the chat box, where it said, Michelle is saying, COVID made us create time out of nothing, right? So we really depend on the kinds of pressures we feel. Our systems can shift. Now, are those shifts sustained over time? We're yet to see, but I want to believe that with enough pressure, we will see those. High level, great comment, Alycia, about just the different, it goes back to the idea of semantic moves, right? So the different words we use, which end up which sound on the surface, they don't sound like anything. There's nothing wrong with high level or strategic or similar kinds of things, but what do they do and what do they really mean? So I think, again, being able to hear those things and hear them for what they intended to be is another really important skill to cultivate. We have our next question, which is around program development, evaluation, and data collection. So how do we bring anti-racism into like the everyday things which organizations do, the program development, the evaluations, data?
I think this is such a great question. And Nancy mentioned this, and I think part of this, it's about, if we want to say goodbye to whiteness, if we want to say goodbye to racism, we need to say hello to it. It's making it visible. And in our program evaluation, in our data collections, we need to make racism visible, and we need to make whiteness visible, and to see if we're making a difference. And how can we do that when we're not asking those questions? How can we do that when we don't have any data that we're collecting on it, when we can't see if we made a difference? And I was the other day, had the opportunity to hear a presentation on a particular health initiative that was coming out, and there was a survey that was done collecting different people's perspectives on it and what needed to be included or not. And I was really interested. I said, what were what were the perspectives of Indigenous people or people of color in this in this initiative? And they didn't collect that. They didn't ask that socio-demographic information. They didn't ask about gender. They didn't ask about race. They didn't ask about socioeconomic status. They didn't ask if, people were using drugs. And this kind of information, when we're paying attention to inequities, especially when we're paying attention to race and racism, we need to ask these questions. And there's some great work happening there, especially around COVID, and some great standards around the collection of race-based data. I know CIHI, the Canadian Institute for Health Information, has some standards that they released earlier this year on collecting race-based data. And this is an increasing priority. I think there's been some calls, I know in British Columbia by the government as well, on the importance of collecting race-based data. So I would say this is so important as a question to consider. And the other thing that I think is also can be helpful, and there are some tools actually, you know, Nancy's done some work around, you know, cultural safety assessments, organizational assessments. So there are, you know, some tools out there, you know, that can actually assess, you know, racism, the impact of racism, the presence of racism in organizations. But let's not forget about our qualitative data. You know, let's not forget about our stories and our experiential data and our lived experience, because that is valid and that's important. And that can give us real insight into where is racism occurring? Where is whiteness coming to surface in our systems that we can start to address? And we need to be able to see that so that we can address it and measure it again so we can see if we're making a difference.
I would just add that, I mean, you need people from, you know, an Indigenous background, Black background, and people of color at the table when you're actually creating your indicator frameworks and deciding what you're actually going to measure and how you're going to measure it. An example is I did some work in health indicators a while back, and we were looking at the CIHI model, and they measured things like falls in hospitals and you know, ease of transfer issues and pieces like that. But when we looked at community indicator frameworks, they wanted to know how many drums were made in the community that year, how many people still spoke the language. So this is a fundamental paradigm shift that you're not going to realize unless you have those voices at the table to be able to express that. And then you can, you know, move along with starting to think differently about the way you evaluate and measure. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Alycia. So we have tons more questions, and we're just going to do one more. And we promise you we're going to go through all of them and do our best to get back to you. And we want to leave a bit of time to talk about what happens next for part 2 next week. So we'll just do the last question here. This question is, how do you navigate your place to get involved as a white or white passing person versus staying in your lane? So, Alycia, I'm going to let, as our white folk person on the line, I'm going to let you answer that question. How do you navigate your place as a white person in this work versus staying in your lane?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, the first thing to do, how to navigate it, is really to, you know, be grounded in your identity as a white person. And, you know, you can't do this work, you can't navigate it again if we're not looking at our own whiteness. And part of that is, you know, being open to, you know, to being reflexive, being open to our mistakes, like I already talked about. I think, you know, the staying in our lane, you know, I think, again, I go back to this idea that, you know, whiteness is a white person's problem. I remember being at I think it was at a Canadian Public Health Association conference. I feel like, you know, we were there together, Nancy, you may have been there together, Sume, as well, but I think we were at a presentation with, by the AFN, the Assembly of First Nations was giving a great presentation. And I think this was in Ontario, and the speaker, was an Indigenous speaker, asked, you know, put up your hand if you're a treaty person. And, you know, all the Indigenous people put up their hands. And then the person who was giving the presentation said, everyone here is a treaty person, because this is a treaty made between Indigenous peoples and white peoples. And I see that, you know, I see that, you know, this is not by, you know, by white people, you know, inserting our voices into the conversation of racism. You know, yes, we need to be paying attention to, are we taking jobs that are meant for Indigenous people? You know, let's look at our rightful position as leaders in this work. But when it comes to, should we speak out? Should we say something? You know, I just try to remember that this is my issue. I take ownership about racism. I'm offended by it. I'm offended by whiteness. It's my responsibility to change it. And yeah, sometimes I might say things and maybe it rubs people the wrong way. I've also, you know, introduced myself as a white person and a white settler in context where it really hasn't resonated with a lot of people, and it hasn't resonated with Indigenous people. And that's okay. You know, we have different perspectives, and sometimes, you know, like really understanding that and kind of letting go of that defensiveness and coming at it from that place of humility is really important. But let's not, someone had something in the chat about our fear, you know, it's like that fear of making a mistake, and let's not get that in the way of something. And that is a repeated, look, this great quote about facing the fear of worsening yourself. And, you know, that's something that I learned, and I've learned it through my own research as well, that fear of doing the wrong thing, that fear of backlash that white people have, the fear of making a mistake, that not knowing how to do it, that uncertainty. Those are all things that get in the way of us doing something about it. You know, sometimes we're so afraid of doing the wrong thing that we don't do anything. And that's how we perpetuate the status quo of white supremacy. So if we want to, you know, if we want to do something, I say go forward, check to see whose lane you're on. But no matter what, you want to keep driving. That's the most important thing.
Thank you, Alycia. Nancy?
I would just say, as Ndumbe-Eyoh, with myself and all my relatives who live on occupied land, it's like all of this land is our lane. So I'll just go where I need to go to be there to do, you know, resistance work and revealing white supremacy. Hi.
Thank you. And as you were both speaking there, I like having the privilege to have being able to say what is my role is an immense and extraordinary privilege. As I was coming to the session, I was thinking about the words of Afua Kupa, where she says, I bear the burden, and she talked about the burden of actually addressing racism. I bear the burden, but it is a righteous burden. And in a sense, because you don't have a choice, right? It's something which impacts your life. So if you're sitting, listen to this and say, what's my role? That's an immense privilege. It's an immense privilege to be able to have the space to ask that question. And I think just taking from what Nancy and Alycia are saying is, you know, start somewhere, and hopefully we have provided you with some, you know, places to start. I'd like to thank you all so much for joining today's conversation. As you all know, we're doing this in two parts. Today has been, we've been doing a lot of talking with some questions. We're inviting you all back next week, same place, same time, Thursday from 1 to 2:30 Eastern, and we will be sending out our registration link tomorrow. You'll get that in your email if you register for the session. It will not be available on our website. You will get it on your email, and that will come to you tomorrow. We will also be circulating some background materials to support the conversations we're going to have next week. Our time with you next week will be a lot more interactive. We're going to get into small groups. We have tons of amazing hosts who were brought on to support this work. Some of them are on the line already. I don't have my list in front of me, so I can't see them. But if you're there, you can do like a wave or something so folks know you're there. But we have about 30 people join in. Nancy, Alycia, and I next support some conversations in small groups. We're looking forward to having you all join us. We will be sending out, hey, there you go. Hey, Laurie, I saw Sammy on the line. I think Carolina's on the line. I see Sarah. So tons of folks are on the line. There we go. So join us next week, and we hope we can continue these conversations with you all. And thank you so much for being part of the conversation. I see Diane there. Again, thank you so much. You'll receive a link to the evaluation in your email tomorrow. And there's probably a link in the chat box as I am speaking right now. So
I just say this final thing as a way of closing, Sume.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to adapt and paraphrase Thomas King from The Truth About Stories. Take the story you've heard today. It's yours. Do with it what you will. Tell it to your friends. Turn it into a television movie. Forget it. But don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if only you had heard the story. You've heard it now.
Thank you, Nancy.